What to do, Dream Team? It's your boy D Neil back with another reaction video, guys. I'm very excited. I've been kind of a history buff lately. I've been enjoying it to learn about the history of different countries, UK being one of them. I want to start jumping more into American history because I feel like all the American history I was taught growing up was a lie. And now I got all the different videos on YouTube that can show me a different perspective than what I was taught or the true perspective. Also, I have a channel where I focus on history in India. So if you guys want to go subscribe to that, it's called Neil Reacts. Go check that out. But yeah, I don't know. Hated history in school. Thought it was so boring. I'm starting to become fascinated by it. Before we jump in, make sure you guys subscribe, ring notification bell, give the video a thumbs up. Thomas, take it away. And I hope you guys like the new setup without the green screen. Why Britain became so powerful. Conquest and culture.
Patterns of conquest have not been determined solely by technology or even by culture in general. Geography, including disease environments, has played a major role in the history of conquest, as it has in the history of cultural evolution in general. The steppes of Central Asia and the plains of Eastern Europe have been far better settings for cavalry charges than the mountainous terrain of the Balkans or the heavily forested parts of Central Europe, while island nations such as Britain and Japan have of course been wholly immune. China tried to create the effects of natural barriers with its Great Wall, as Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the Maginot Line in pre-war France attempted the same thing on a smaller scale. Geographic barriers have spared some peoples from conquest or delayed its coming. Mountainous terrain has permitted independence to persist in some places long after the adjoining lowlands have been overrun by invaders. Morocco, Ceylon, Abyssinia, Scotland, and Tibet are just some of the places in which this has been so. However, geographical barriers have been a mixed blessing, as technological and cultural backwardness have likewise been the fates of many of these isolated regions. Moreover, the relative poverty of such regions has also been one of the deterrents to conquest, along with the fighting abilities of mountain men, for there was little or no profit to be had from the conquest of many such areas. Differential resistance to one another's diseases, which played a key role in the conquest of the Western Hemisphere, retarded the conquest of Africa until much later in history, because it was the indigenous peoples who succumbed to new, mixed disease environments in the Americas, while it was the Europeans who were fatally vulnerable to the diseases of tropical Africa until quinine and other modern medical and public health measures made it possible for them to survive amid the tropical diseases that flourished south of the Sahara.
So over in America, it was the indigenous who suffered from disease, the mixed bag of diseases that was brought over by colonizers. But over in Europe, it was the British who actually suffered. I mean, over in Africa, it was the British who actually suffered from these diseases when they went over there, of course, until medicine advanced, you know what I'm saying? The advancement of medicine, and they figured out how to cure these things. But that's very interesting to know. And it's also really cool, like, I guess when I think of conquest and conquering, I just don't really think of geography, which when listening to him in those first 2 minutes sounds very naive and very kind of dumb of me to not think of that when it comes to conquest. But yeah, geography would be huge. In more disease-ridden lands, I mean, you have geographic barriers that people try, man-made barriers as well, people tried to put up to stop this. But also you have lands that are just harder to conquer. You know what I'm saying? Terrain, land, all of it. It's just harder for people to come in and conquer and conquest, and it's going to delay them or it's going to stop them. But also, I mean, poverty, if you're like living in the mountains or living in poverty, is like, well, like, there's no profit in coming to conquer those lands anyway. So, like, it kind of deters people from wanting to do that in the first place. But it's very interesting to listen to this. I'm becoming fascinated by history.
For them to survive amid the tropical diseases that flourished south of the Sahara. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans long protected the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere from the conquerors of the rest of the world, and, even as late as the first half of the 20th century, These oceans made isolationism a viable option for the United States, as it was not for most of the nations of Europe or Asia. However, smaller bodies of water may facilitate rather than impede military attacks, for huge differences between the high cost of land transport and the low cost of water transport can be as important militarily as it has been economically. During the Crimean War, for example, the British and the French attacking forces were supplied by water, while the Russian defenders at Sevastopol had to be supplied by land, since the waters were controlled by British and French warships. Even with approximately 125,000 peasant carts requisitioned to supply the defenders from their own adjacent homeland, their limited supplies of ammunition did not permit them to reply in kind to the barrages fired at them from the sea.
Wow.
Nor was this simply a matter of conditions favoring attackers or defenders in general. Both in Spain and in Russia, Napoleon's attacking armies met disaster when they had to be supplied over land, while the opposing armies were supplied across water.
Dang.
The inaccessibility of African rivers to ocean-going warships made this continent less vulnerable to European naval power than much of the Western Hemisphere was. The Dutch, for example, could send ocean-going vessels more than 100 miles up the Hudson River to establish an outpost at what would later become the city of Albany. No river in Africa was that accessible, whether due to insufficient water levels or, more commonly, sandbars, cascades, and waterfalls. The shallow coastal waters in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa meant that large European warships could often not get close enough to the shore in many places, necessitating the loading of European troops into smaller boats, which could in many places be effectively opposed by Africans in similar-sized boats, particularly in the early centuries before European firearms had developed the accuracy and speed of firing that they would have in later eras.
Yeah.
The history of the British people, like the history of other peoples around the world, illustrates the enormous importance of human capital, whether in the form of specific skills, general education, or traditions and laws that facilitate both economic development and the development of free institutions. The many centuries that it took for the British to rise from cultural and economic backwardness to the forefront of world civilization in technology and political dominance suggests something of the difficulty of acquiring the necessary human capital. The vital role played in this process by numerous other peoples who came to the British Isles, whether as conquerors, immigrants, or refugees, also suggests how important cultural diffusion is. The Romans, the Normans, the Jews, the Lombards, and the Huguenots all contributed in important ways at different historical junctures to what would ultimately become a British achievement.
Really?
The geography of the British Isles also played an important role, not in determining what people would do, but in determining the boundaries of what was possible. The simple fact that Britain is an island nation, and that water transport is vastly cheaper than land transport, and was especially so in the era before railroads, meant that the British could transport heavy raw materials, like coal, to different parts of the United Kingdom much more cheaply and rapidly than was possible within nations with large interiors, such as Germany or the United States, both of which...
So if you were dependent on land transport, you were at a disadvantage over a country that depended on water transport. He said it was more fast, or it was quicker and a lot cheaper, which is huge. But it just sounds like Britain was just ahead in everything, in advancements of everything. It sounds like they figured out the system. Hey, we got to get capital to make all these things happen. And there was so much help from, the Jews and so many other different, the Romans, so many other different people. Whether people was coming to conquer their land or anything. I think that's absolutely awesome. I think the British just figured it out. And they were just more advanced than everybody. I feel like whatever role geography played, and it sounded like it played a great role for Britain, you have to figure out how to make the most of it. So, know what I'm saying? If you were on an island or one of the isles or whatever, you got to make the most of what geography you're on. If you're stuck on mostly land, you got to make the most of what geography you're on. And I feel like, I don't know, listening to this, it sounds like Britain just kind of made the most of whatever position that they were in. And so it kind of sounds like that's why they were advancing. I mean, of course, that like I said, there were a lot of things that worked in their favor, where they were located, their geography, a lot of things. But at the end of the day, I think Britain just made the most of what they had. They worked with what they had, and they made the most of it, and they were able to advance before all the other European nations.
Nations with large interiors, such as Germany or the United States, both of which had to wait for the era of railroads to challenge the British in industrialization.
Okay.
The fact that the key raw materials of the industrial age, iron ore and coal, were located very near each other and also near navigable waterways in Britain, again gave the British decisive early advantages over countries like Germany and the United States, as well as permanent advantages over regions of the world where such natural resources do not exist at all and cannot be imported at any feasible economic cost. Significantly, Japan, one of the few countries that was later able to rise to the industrial forefront without such natural resources, is an island like Britain, and no part of Japan is more than 70 miles from the sea, so imported raw materials could be brought in economically, as would be virtually impossible in the Balkans or in much of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, due to more formidable geographical barriers in these places. Geographical advantages and cultural imports have permitted more to be accomplished within the British Isles than in many other parts of the world, but ultimately it was the British themselves who had to accomplish it. That they did so has had enormous consequences, not only for the inhabitants of the United Kingdom or even for past and present members of the British Empire or Commonwealths, but for the entire world. The highly varying degrees to which different segments of the British population acquired the necessary human capital demonstrates that the opportunity alone is not sufficient for economic or other accomplishments.
Facts.
Nor was it simply a matter of what the existing society permitted to different groups, for those same groups showed similar economic and social patterns when transplanted to other societies in North America or in Australia and New Zealand. British law and its traditions of impartiality made London a magnet for the capital of the world, enabling Britain to industrialize with other people's capital as well as its own. In a later era, the British colony of Hong Kong would similarly attract capital from around the world by the dependability and impartiality of its laws, while many poverty-stricken countries were unable to obtain much-needed capital because of their undependable laws and confiscatory policies toward foreign investors. British law was of course more than an economic asset. Its separation of powers and rights of citizens against the government were the foundation of the freedom of the British themselves. The revolutions of the 17th century, including the beheading of King Charles I in 1649 and the uprisings in 1688 that led James II to flee to France, made the separation of powers even more dramatically vindicated and an indelible part of the British Constitution. While many other countries copied British systems of law and government, those that succeeded in creating similarly free governments were largely those that came from the same tradition: the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, for the historical experiences that were distilled into powerful traditions were essential to the functioning of the legal and political institutions themselves. While these institutions could be copied by anyone, the history and traditions behind them could not be synthesized, and it was these intangibles that made the tangible institutions and structures work.
I think that was absolutely incredible. That was absolutely fascinating to kind of learn how Britain, became more advanced than the other nations. And like I said, like right before he said it, they made the most out of what they had. And then he says, like, yes, they had geographical advantages in certain ways, but that's not enough alone, right? Opportunity is not enough alone. You have to be able to execute. You have to make the most out of what you have. Yes, you may have advantages, but you still got to figure out how to make those advantages work for you. Or you might have disadvantages. Well, you got to figure out how to make them not, I don't know. You got to figure out how to get around them. There you go. You got to figure out how to get around the disadvantages. And so for the U.S. and other nations, right, the railroads were huge. those were a disadvantage where they weren't able to transport by water, but depended more on transporting things by land. To got around the disadvantage, railroads were created. All right, now we can go out there and compete with Britain. But Britain kind of wrote the blueprint, and these countries, it was like you may not be able to copy it exactly, but you can take some things from that blueprint. You can see what worked, what might not have worked, or what's gonna work better for your people. You know what I'm saying? And you can kind of work around that blueprint and create something amazing for yourself and get your country more advanced. I think that was an incredible video. That's all we have. Make sure you guys subscribe, ring notification bell, get the video a thumbs up. It's your boy D Neil. Out.